Today is really the first really spring-like day we've had. I thought I'd talk about something a little bit more fun today than usual, maybe. Most of you know I'm in the final phases of putting together a book on Buddhist cosmology, and I've been the last few days revising my chapter on Devas and Bhumma Devas in particular. So I'll inflict that upon you today. Talk about Bhumma Devas. This gives us some. I think it's an appropriate topic because it'll give us an idea of the Buddhist relation to nature. The Bhumma Devas are the Devas of the earth. Devas, in general, are a class of beings that are more refined, more subtle in their existence than humans. The word Deva, the etymology of it is not certain. It either comes from a root meaning to play or from a root meaning bright or shining. The word has got a kind of a convoluted history. It's come via various twisted pathways. It's come into English in both the form theo from Greek, a combining form like in theology, meaning a god, and it also is the root for the word devil. D-E-V in devil comes from Dewa. So sometimes in English translation they're called gods. It's a little bit misleading to think of them as gods. The Devas, a class of beings, and they have various levels and grades of Devas. The higher ones live in various special realms called sagas that are sometimes called sensual heavens in English, translated realms beyond the earthly plane. But there's a whole class. The lowest class of Devas are called Bhumma Devas. They're the Devas of the earth. And there's all kinds of them. They're very often associated as living in forests and in trees. There's a class of them called Ruka Devas, tree Devas, that live in trees, and even in smaller vegetation. And they have amongst themselves a kind of a hierarchy. The ones who live in big impressive trees tend to look down on the ones that live in little shrubs and bushes. And there's a story that there was a Dewa living in a big tree in the royal forest, and he was very proud of his position in this massive big tree, until one day the king's carpenters came by looking for a big tree to cut down to make into planks for some construction, and they put a mark on his tree. So now he was all frightened his tree was going to be cut down, and none of the other tree Devas could think of a way to save him or help him. But a humble little Dewa that lived in a clump of kusa grass said, "I can save you." And then when before the king's carpenters came, this Dewa transformed himself into the form of a chameleon, and he magically created holes in the big tree. And when the carpenters came, he peeked his chameleon head out of one of the holes, and the carpenter said, "Oh, this tree is rotten through and through. There's no point taking this one." And so they walked by and left it. The Buddha gives this story as a teaching not to judge people by their position in society. That a humble person can be a good person, and there's like a teaching against snobbishness. Devas can be wise or foolish. They're not of one nature. There's a foolish Dewa who lived in a tree in the forest, and a lion had taken to sleeping under the tree. And this Deva decided he didn't want the lion there because the lion was stinky. This is something about Devas being, in general, Devas have a more refined nature than ordinary biological life, and they think that human beings and animals stink. They don't want to be inflicted by our odors. So this Deva wanted to get rid of the lion, so he manifested himself into some kind of ferocious-looking monstrous form and scared the lion away. And then pretty soon after that, carpenters came and cut him down, cut the tree down. The lion had been keeping the humans away. There's a similar anecdote about the wise and foolish Devas, that the foolish ones chose to set their homes up in trees close to the human towns and villages because the humans would give them offerings and worship them. And the wise ones went deep in the forest where they could grow strong and tall and the branches could interlock and they're protected from the wind. And the ones who live near the towns and villages eventually end up being cut down to clear land or to get planks or whatever. There is still in Southeast Asia, the people make offerings to Devas. If anyone has been to Thailand, you see everywhere what they call spirit houses. They're like little doll houses on stilts that are in front of many homes, probably most places. Certainly in the countryside, they're everywhere, and also in the city you'll see quite a few of them. And those are for spirits or Devas to live in, so they don't bother the inhabitants of the house. And the people come and give them offerings, a few grains of rice and so on. The Devas don't only live in trees and plants. There's also Devas of rivers, Devas of the sea, Devas of the sky, Devas of the town, Nagara Devas, the towns. Story about a river Deva was two brothers. They were merchants, and one was good and honest and the other was a crook. And they'd gone together on some kind of voyage down the Ganges River for trading purposes, and they'd made 1,000 pieces of money. So when they get home, they were going to split it 50-50, but the crooked one thought he'd got a plan to get it all. And the pieces of money were wrapped up in a cloth bag, and he got an identical cloth bag and filled it with gravel. And then when they hit a rough patch in the river, he pretended to stumble and accidentally, on purpose, kicked what he thought was the gravel bag into the river and said, "Oh, the money's gone," when he had the gold bag hidden. But he'd made a mistake and put the money in the river. Now, before they'd set sail, the good brother had made an offering to the river Deva for a safe voyage. He'd done a little ceremony and sprinkled some rice grains or something in the river and made a little invocation, "May the Devas of the river protect me in my voyage." And the river Deva received this offering and became more powerful. Which is kind of an interesting point. The human offering had increased the power of this Deva, and he was grateful to the good brother. And when he saw the money go in the water, he figured what had happened, and he made a big fish, swallow the gold, and then get caught by fishermen. And then he possessed the minds of the fishermen. And when they went into the town to sell the fish, people would ask him, "How much you want for this fish?" And they said, 1,000 pieces of gold plus 8 pennies. And someone says, "Who ever heard of a fish worth 1,000 pieces of gold?" And everyone just thought they were nuts. And then they finally they came to this brother's place and they said, "How much for the fish?" And they said, "For you, 8 pennies. "Well, what are you asking everybody else?" 1,000 pieces of gold plus 8 pennies. So this brother was quite clever, and he figured it was probably the missing money somehow. So he bought the fish for 8 pennies, and of course the money was inside the fish. Sometimes the Devas are mischievous. There's a story about Buddhaghosa, the author of the Sudimagga, who's one of the, should say, the premier scholar of Theravada tradition. The Sudimagga is a tremendous work of scholarship, and he came from North India, traveled to Sri Lanka to study their sources there, and did all his work there, and he did a great corpus of work, and his final effort was the Visuddhimagga, which is the summary of the teachings. And it's a pretty massive book and very dense. And when he finished the manuscript and he was ready to present it to the assembled monks the next day, during the night, mischievous Devas hid the manuscript. They stole it away and hid it. And when he couldn't find it in the morning, he just started work again and wrote it out again. And then when he'd written this second time, the Devas brought the manuscript back, and it was compared, and the two were identical syllable for syllable. There's another one about a mischievous Deva. There was a monk who, the Deva wanted to play a practical joke or a prank on him. And when he went into the bushes to relieve himself, and he came out of the bushes, this Deva assumed the form of a young girl walking behind him and straightening her dress. So all the other monks thought he'd been fooling around with this girl in the bushes. And he got a bad reputation after that until it was revealed what had happened. In the sequel to the story, after suffering bad karma for a long time because of doing this, the Deva took bad rebirths, but then finally was reborn as a human and became a monk himself. But the last residue of his karma was everywhere he walked, there was this image of a young girl walking behind him. It was just like a phantom. And so he had a bad reputation for a long time until that got cleared up. The Devas of the ocean, there's a story about some merchants who were shipwrecked at sea, and there was a Naga, which is another kind of mythical being, a great serpent that changes shape. A Naga that saved them by transforming himself into a ship. And a sea Deva, Samudra Deva, took the helm of the ship and cried out, "Who's bound for Jambudipa?" That's India. Who's bound for India? So, and they all scrambled aboard. And sometimes Devas attach themselves to a person or a place as guardians, called Araka Devas, guardian Devas. There was a king of the Kurus whose mother, after she died, turned into a Deva and became his guardian Deva. And the king was fond of gambling. And she would hover in the air and magically affect the throw of the dice, so he never lost. Until he played against a powerful Yaka chieftain who took the form of a Brahmin youth. And when he was sitting across the gaming table from the king, being a Yaka, he could see this invisible Deva hovering in the air. And he looked at them with his eyes, and he let them turn back into Yaka eyes, which are red. And this terrified this Deva, knew this was a powerful Yaka, and she fled away to the edge of the world. And the king no longer had his edge, and he lost his big bet with the Yaka. There's another example of guardian Devas. It's kind of a strange story. It was a war between two kings, and they assembled their armies. And this one king sent one of his counselors to see this holy man, this sage, and ask him if he had a prediction of what would happen in the battle. And the sage said, "My powers are limited. I can see that one king will be overthrown, but I can't see which." Well, that's pretty useless. But Saka is going to come to see me tomorrow, and I'll ask him. Sakka is the king of the Devas of Tawatingsa, a very high-level deity. And he came down to earth to see this holy man, and he predicted that the other king would win. And he said, you will see in the battle, their guardian deities will take the form of bulls. There'll be a white bull and a black bull. And this one king, who's the hero of the story, his guardian deity was the black bull, and the other one was the white bull. And they will fight, and the white bull will kill the black bull, and that will be the end of this kingdom. So when this word got back to the king, he said, well, we're going to take preemptive measures. And he had 1,000 spearmen diverted from the battle to attack the enemy bull and kill the bull, kill the guardian deva of the other side. And so they won the battle. It's a really strange story in a lot of ways. It shows that Sakka is not infallible. That he made a prediction, and that the humans were able to defeat his prediction. And the deva was killed by ordinary earthly means, just by spears. We see that the Devas, the Bhumma Devas, are pretty vulnerable. That they can be killed when their tree is cut down, if they're a tree deity. And this was the origin of one of the rules for the monks. We're not supposed to cut living plants. And the origin story of that is there was a Deva who was living in a tree, and a monk was cutting branches off the tree to build something, and he cut the arm off the Deva's child. And the mother Deva went to the Buddha to complain about it. And so the Buddha laid down a law for the monks are not allowed to cut living plants. At least that's one version of the story. In the more legalistic Vinaya text, it lays out a more prosaic account. It just says that the monks were cutting plants to clear ground for building kutis, and the lay people complained, are these monks or are these foresters? What are they doing this manual work for? So the Buddha said that is bringing the reputation of the Sangha down, so don't do that anymore. So the idea, the general idea with the Bhumma Devas is that they're very numerous, and they're everywhere in trees and plants and rivers and the sea and the land and in the air. There's sky Devas that affect the weather. And this is kind of a characteristic of a lot of the sutta material, at least, is that there's a naturalistic explanation for the weather besides intervention by Devas. It says most ordinary weather is just a natural process of heat and cold, but extraordinary weather events are caused by the Devas, rain out of season or so on. And it's the Devas are playing. The cloud Devas play. They enjoy rainstorms. And there's different classes of them. There's rain Devas and hail Devas and snow Devas. And when they feel like playing, they cause that kind of a storm. And human beings affect the Devas. If the morality of human beings is good, then the Devas are pleased and they keep the weather in bounds in season. But if the morality of the humans is bad, then the Devas become disgruntled and upset, and they cause storms and bad weather or droughts. Also, the different levels of being have ripple effects on each other. One of the stories that has a lot of significance in the tradition is the story of the quarrel at Kasambi. It's often cited as a bad example not to follow of how we should live in harmony, particularly the bhikkhus, the monks amongst themselves should live in harmony. The story is that there was this big monastery at Kasambi, and there were two elder monks. One was a master of Dhamma and one was a master of Vinaya. Vinaya is the rules and regulations for the monks, and the Dhamma is the teachings. And one time the Dhamma master went to the toilet, and when he left the toilet, he left a little water in the scoop. And when the Vinaya master walked in, he looked, he saw water in the scoop, and he said, "Venerable sir, you've left a little water in the scoop. You know that's an offense." And he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I did not know that was an offense." And that was the end of their exchange. But then their disciples, their students, picked this up, and the students of the Vinaya master said, your master's a fool. He doesn't know what's an offense and what's not an offense." And the students of the Dhamma master said, "Your master's a fool. He's criticizing our master for trivial things." And then they started, the quarrel got more and more heated, and they said they stabbed each other with verbal daggers. And they couldn't make peace amongst themselves, and they split into two factions. And one of the results of that was the Buddha tried to resolve the dispute, and they wouldn't listen to him, so he left. And when he left, the lay people got disgusted. "We had the Buddha in our town, and he left now because of you lot." So they stopped supporting the monks and forced them to mend their ways. But another result was that the guardian Devas of the two factions began to quarrel. And all the Bhumma Devas in the local area began to split into two factions and quarrel. And that spread all the way up, realm to realm, all the way up to the Brahma gods. The whole universe was split into two factions over a few drops of water in the water scoop. And one interesting detail about the Bhumma Devas that marks them out as has a peculiar place is that when a higher Deva, if a higher Deva ever attains to the state of an Arahant, that is a perfectly enlightened being, then they immediately die, because they can't exist in a sensual desire heaven. There's no seclusion from sensuality there, so an Arahant's unable to exist there. If a human being becomes an Arahant, then if a human layperson becomes an Arahant, within 7 days they either die or they seek ordination, because they can't live in the lay existence, the sensuality of the lay existence, and be an Arahant. But a Bhumma Deva is able to become an Arahant and remain in their state as a Bhumma Deva, because they can seclude themselves in a remote forest place and be separated from all kind of confusions and desirable objects of the sense desire realm. They can choose to live in some remote place. So they have this unique status that they can actually become an Arahant and continue to exist as a Deva. Most of them probably don't do that. They're not in general, they're beneficent. They're good-hearted beings in general, but they're not particularly very wise. People are reborn into that realm if they're basically good and generous, but have maybe some small deficiency in their morality, so they can't make it to a higher plane. They become a Bhumma Deva. There was a highwayman, a robber, who was captured by the king's men, and he was going to be executed. And as they were marching him through the streets, there was to the place of execution, there was a woman in the street who took pity on him and gave him a sweet cake. And it was one of the Buddha's disciples. I think it was Moggallana, I can't recall who, but one of the great disciples of the Buddha saw this fellow being led to the execution ground, and he knew with his psychic power that actually he could be saved and take a higher rebirth if he would make an act of merit. So he walked by close to this fellow, hoping the fellow would take the hint, and the fellow gave his sweet cake to the monk and made this aspiration, may I have a higher rebirth. And with his merit from that, he should have been reborn into Tawatingsa heaven. But just as they were about to chop his head off, he thought about this girl who gave him the sweet cake with sensual desire in his mind. so he became a tree Deva, living in a little tree in the forest. Someone was reborn as a Bhumma Deva because he helped a traveler fix his wagon wheel. Nowadays, you help somebody else fix a flat. That's enough merit to get you reborn as a Bhumma Deva at least. There's another fellow was reborn as a Bhumma Deva because all he did was there was in his town there was a place where they gave alms to beggars and to wandering holy men. Anyone could come and get free food, and all he did was when people came looking for where this place is, he would stand in front of his house and point the way, but with a cheerful and generous heart. It's like, it's over there. And so when he died, he was reborn as a Dewa in a banyan tree. And when travelers came by and they took shelter under the tree, they would see this magical hand come out of the tree and point. And where it pointed, there would appear jugs of water and bowls of food for them. Even down to modern times, there's some incidents. There's a story in Mahabua's biography of Ajahn Mun. One of Ajahn Mun's disciples did a walking pilgrimage from Thailand to India, and on the way back, he unfortunately the timing was bad, and World War II broke out while he was in India. And Thailand was on the Japanese side, and he had to cross through Burma, which was a British colony. So he couldn't go anywhere near the populated places. He had to walk through lonely forest paths. And he'd been 3 days or more without any food, and thought he was going to perish. He hadn't seen a single human being for days. And he sat down exhausted, and then he saw this figure walk out from behind a tree, it says he was dressed in the attire that a Burmese nobleman of 200 years before would have worn. And this is in the middle of the forest, in the middle of nowhere. This fellow walks out from behind a tree with a silver platter loaded with all kinds of food. He offers it to the monk, and he walks around behind the tree again and disappears. And that gives him enough sustenance to make it back to Thailand. So there's a general sense in the Buddhist tradition, and it's found in the old books, and it's still in Southeast Asia. It's still quite a living sense that it becomes almost pantheistic, that everything's alive in a sense. There's Devas everywhere, in trees and plants and gateways. The Devas of the town tend to live in gateways, and rivers, the sea, the sky. It's all teeming with this invisible life of Devas. And as I mentioned, in Thailand, they still have these spirit houses, and there'll be often one for everybody as a personal one at their house. So there's often a larger, more elaborate one for the village, for the guardian Deva of the village. By the village gate, there'll be a little shrine for the local Devas, and people will make offerings and do ceremonies there. I read once that there was in I think it's pretty much custom has died out now, but in olden times in Thailand, a common form of marriage ceremony was that the young couple would simply go, after consummating the marriage, they would go to the village shrine and make an offering, and it just announced to the guardian Dewa, we're now a couple. That was the marriage. So that kind of relationship with the beneficial powers of the earth and the rivers and so on, it is definitely has an animistic root. It goes all the way back to ancient India. And some purists see it as a corruption of Buddhism. And there was actually a movement in Thailand in the early 20th century, led by some prominent Dhammayut monks, to suppress the spirit houses. Trying to tell people to destroy their spirit houses. This is like heathenism. It's nothing to do with Buddhism, and it's certainly not the highest expression of Buddhism. And it has a root in the folk culture that probably precedes Buddhism in Southeast Asia, but it's not alien to Buddhism either, because it's also found in the Buddhist texts, in the Jataka stories and the Dhammapada stories are full of mentions of Devas and so on. What is condemned in the Buddhist texts is the sacrifice of living beings to Devas. There's a few instances of that where people would sacrifice goats or something to, even human sacrifices mentioned, to appease the Devas or the Yakas. And Buddhism always stood against that. There's a number of incidents where the Buddha himself intervened when there was some big sacrifice going to happen, and he would talk to the king or the nobleman who was organizing this thing and saying, you're just making yourself much more bad karma. Proper way is to keep morality, never mind these sacrifices. Because that was the original Vedic religion, was based on sacrifice, like most primitive religious expressions. The Greeks, the Jews, so a lot of people had some form of sacrificial religion. And it was the common form in ancient India, and it was really only after Buddhism came into India that the sacrifice was put away. There's also, should be mentioned, a fine line between Devas and Yakas. That it's not always possible to distinguish the two. The Yakas are generally malevolent beings, fierce beings that kill and eat people in many of the stories. Although they can be tamed and become guardians, Lokapalas, guardians of the world. And you'll see in monasteries and temples and palaces and so on in Southeast Asia, often in front of the gate, there'll be these statues of these ferocious dog-headed ogre-like beings with swords or clubs, and those represent yakas that have been tamed and are acting as guardians to keep the evil spirits away. Sometimes the yakas and the devas intermingle. The line between them is thin. And if a yaka attains to a stage of enlightenment, there's stories about yakas becoming stream winners, the first stage of enlightenment. Then their body transforms into a dewa body, because it said that a stream winner cannot exist in a monstrous shape. So they become devas who are, have quite graceful, beautiful forms. So yakas are ugly and monstrous looking. There was a family, a mother and a father and 3 children, and the children all were devout followers of the Buddha, but the parents were not. They were evil-minded and drunkards and wasters and so on, and the house was struck by lightning and burned down. They were all killed. and they were reborn. The parents were reborn as yakas, and the children as devas, and they continued to all live together in a vimana, a spirit, a magical house that appeared, in the place, invisible to humans, but a dwelling for these beings. And the story is that Moggallana saw them. Moggallana was the Buddha's disciple who had psychic powers, and he could see into these realms easily. He saw the 5 of them traveling together one day to go to a meeting of yakas. And the 3 children were all riding in wonderful golden chariots and canopies, and the 2 parents who'd been reborn as yakas, they were following behind in ugly yaka forms, carrying big clubs and beating each other on the head with the club, and then licking the blood, feeding on the blood that flowed from the other one. Mom, you're embarrassing me again. So there's all kinds of variety in these other realms. It's not a simple picture, but there is a sense that it's everywhere. They're everywhere. There's different, besides yakas and devas. There on this earth, there's nagas and kinnaras and all kinds of supanas. Nagas are magical serpent beings, and kinnaras are funny things. They're like little people. The word kinnara means "is it human?" because people see them and wonder, "Is it human?" And they live in remote forest places, and they depict it as being very, like, playful and singing and dancing beautifully. And they enchant people with their singing and their dancing. A number of the stories concern the deep love and attachment that they have for their mates. There's a story about a king wandering in the Himalaya, the magical forests north of the Himalaya mountains, and he comes across a pair of kinnara hugging each other and crying. And he asked them, why do they weep so? And they said that 700 years ago we were out gathering flower blossoms to make garlands, and there was a sudden rainstorm, and the little creek that was between us grew into a torrent, and we were separated for the entire night. And every time we remember that horrible night, we weep and cry. 700 years ago. So I think I'll stop there. Probably inflicted enough of this this stuff on you.